converso families who had been forcibly converted to Roman Catholicism in the centuries before, but despite that were persecuted by the Inquisition. Yes, today I will talk about Africans and Afro-Jews in Amsterdam in the 17th century and their relations. From the early 1630s onwards, something unique to Northwestern Europe emerged in Amsterdam. For the first time, a small Black community was formed in a Northern European city, consisting of Black men and women from all over the Atlantic, including Portugal. This was possible because of two important developments in the first half of the 17th century. Both of them are connected to the migration histories of the Amsterdam Sephardim. From the late 16th century onwards, Sephardic families from the Iberian Peninsula settled in the Dutch Republic, as you know. Converso families who had been forcibly converted to Roman Catholicism in the centuries before, but despite that were persecuted by the Inquisition. These Iberian migrants in Amsterdam came from an environment where slavery was permitted. For example, in Lisbon around 1600, at least 10% of the population was of African descent, free and enslaved. And slavery was also common in Spain. Some of the Sephardic families who settled in Amsterdam took servants of African descent with them to the city, as they had done in the 16th century to Antwerp. But there were, as we shall see in this paper, also Jewish migrants of mixed descent. Sometime in the first quarter of the 17th century, Ernst Brink, after a grand tour through the Low Countries and Germany, wrote of his visits to Amsterdam. In die Breestraten wonen meest alle Portugezen, zijn de meest Joden, hebbende ook in huis haar vergadering. Vast al haar dienstboden zijn slaven en de Moren. So most of the Portuguese, being largely Jews, live in the Breestraat, the Jodenbreestraat, and also have a house there where they gather. Almost all of their servants are slaves and Moors. That's what he wrote in early 1700s. This observation is also confirmed in the records of the Portuguese Jewish community, in the burial books of Bethlehem, and the distribution to the poor, and in notarial deeds. The oldest registers of the Portuguese cemetery in Oudekerk aan de Amstel mention negras, escravas, and mulatas that are buried there. On the 28th of September, on the 28th of September 1617, a female slave of Abraham Aboas was buried behind the slave of David Neto. And on the 25th of December, a mulatto woman of the mulatto trumpet, was buried next to the David Soares. I think the most famous example is on March 27, Eliezer Moreno was buried, a Black man from the house of poet Paulo de Pina, also known as Rohil Jesserun. This is nowadays there's a special commemoration every year for Eliezer, and there's a statue made by the Surinamese artist Erwin de Vries, himself of mixed Afro-Jewish descent, now stands next to the Bethlehem Cemetery. Occasionally, Black servants appeared before a notary to give a statement. For example, on the 3rd of August 1612, Domingos, a Black slave of Dr. Francisco Lopez Henriquez, also known as David Farrar, declared that he had been incited by a certain Lisbeth who lived in a cellar in the Jodenbreestraat to steal Farrar's silverware and other items. On March 14, 1622, the 27-year-old Margarita Fonso, Moça Negra, so Black girl, authorized 2 Portuguese merchants to claim her salary from the inheritance of Felipe de Sá, for whom she had worked for 6 years. And also in this early period, we see within the Jewish neighborhood some marriages of Black people. Like in May 1616, the Black sailor Bastian from Angola married to Lisbeth Jans from Angola. The presence of these Black servants in the Sephardic community can also be seen in Romein de Hoge's prints of the community from the last quarter of the 17th century. Of course, here in front of the Huis de Pinto in the Sint Antonius Breestraat, you see two Black figures, one prominently in a beautiful costume and the other one somewhat hidden behind the two ladies. And on this print of the Teba in the then new Portuguese Synagogue, in the right foreground behind the two men, we see also in the back a Black man who quite remarkably does not wear a head covering. The second development that is important is the expansion of the Dutch Republic as an international trading and colonial power. The inhabitants of the Dutch Republic also began to move and trade more actively in the Atlantic region, along the coast of West Africa, North and South America, and the Caribbean. In 1621, the Dutch East India Company was founded, and in 1624, there was the first attempt to conquer a part of Brazil, the important city of Salvador de Bahia. This, from the point of view of the Dutch West Indian Company, ended in a failure, and in 1625, the city was recaptured by the Portuguese. 5 years later, on February 14, 1630, Olinda, the capital of the rich sugar province of Pernambuco, was besieged by 67 ships and 7,000 troops. In March, the city was taken and looted. One of the victims of the plunders was the new Christian merchant Simeão Drago, who would settle in Amsterdam shortly thereafter. On August 30th, 1631, Samuel Cohen stated that he had sailed out to Brazil in the service of West India Company under General Locke, and that he was present at the capture of the city of Olinda. He stated that the then prosperous merchant Drago had a large house there, that Drago was imprisoned by the West Indian Company and his warehouse looted, capturing some 80 pipes of wine. We can, of course, imagine what the soldiers did with those pipes of wine. It marked the beginning of just under 20 years that the WIC had control in Pernambuco. Recife, located just outside of Olinda, became the capital of Dutch Brazil. And like Amsterdam, the WIC adopted a relatively tolerant attitude towards Jews. So Jewish life flourished in Recife. Not only were there many new Christians living in Pernambuco, that there were also many Sephardic Jews among the colonists from Europe. In the Rua dos Judeus, the first synagogue of the Americas was founded. During this period, there was a continuous flow of ships between the Dutch Republic and Pernambuco, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors, but also passengers and migrants. They regularly took Black servants with them to Amsterdam. For example, in 1635, Francisco Coresina d'Abreu and his wife, children, family, and enslaved servants, all together, a company of 24 people, left on the ship Domburg, as did George Rodriguez Brandao and his wife, with their 4 children and an enslaved servant. In 1645, Abraham Pereira, his wife Esther, his sister Rachel Diaz, and a Black woman named Katerina left for Amsterdam. At least as important was the fact that some of these ships carried Afro-Atlantic seamen, who, like other seamen, checked out of Amsterdam and went in search of a place to sleep and entertain themselves. And Already from the 1630s, Jews from Brazil settled in Amsterdam, a fact that was reinforced by in the 1640s by the Portuguese revolt in Dutch Brazil after the departure of Johan Maurits in 1644. But also before that, people like the aforementioned Simeão Drago, and also one of the main characters in the story later on, Moses Moreno Monsanto, settled in Amsterdam as early as the 1630s. This may also apply to the David Nassi, the later founder of the Jewish community in Suriname, whose background is still shrouded in mystery. After the loss of Dutch Brazil, most of the openly Jewish people and the other non-Catholics left Brazil. Among them were also black soldiers who had fought on the Dutch side. In the process, the poor who could not pay for passage were divided among the various departing ships, as evidenced by a statement made by Matasia Moreno upon arrival in the Dutch Republic. Several Jewish and non-Jewish returnees and migrants took black servants and relatives back to the Dutch Republic. For example, Elião de Burgos, who brought 22-year-old Juliana and 14-year-old Esperanza with him. During the 17th century, dozens or even hundreds of black people settled in Amsterdam, voluntary or involuntary, mainly in the area of the Jodebreestraat and Vlooienburg, where they often lived as servants in the house of Sephardim, but also there were several black families living in basement dwellings in the Turfstraat and the Leprozensteeg. So most of these black servants had a background in slavery, a phenomenon that had no longer existed in the Low Countries for hundreds of years. It is significant that in the course of the 17th century, the ban on slavery was explicitly incorporated in the printed codes of law, as you can see here. From 1644, under the heading of Van de Staat en de conditie van personen, so the status of conditions of persons, the legal code included the following stipulation. Within the city of Amsterdam and its jurisdiction, all men are free, for all people are free, and none are slaves. This was a clear declaration that in the city did not condone slavery and that every person was free. The second article determined how this freedom could be claimed. The same applies to all slaves who come or are brought to the city and its jurisdiction. They are free and beyond the control and authorities of their masters and wives. And insofar as their masters and mistresses wish to keep their slaves and make them serve against their will, the person concerned can arraign said masters and mistresses in the court of law in this city, where they then shall formally and legally declared free. This was literally adopted from the Antwerp law. Freedom of slavery thus applied in principle to everyone in Amsterdam. If someone was held as a slave, that person could take the owner to the municipal court and be declared free there. The initiative for this lay with the person who was enslaved. It is not known how often people took such steps. But in 1656, 24-year-old Juliana, who came to Amsterdam with Elião de Burgos, just decided to run away instead of moving with him to Barbados. Occasionally, someone was declared free at the notary's office, such as Sabelinha from Guinea and her children, who had come to Amsterdam with Simon Correa from Brazil. They were granted their freedom on the 3rd of October, 1642. And I know of one enslaved woman who was brought from Brazil to Amsterdam by a Sephardic merchant who actually went to court in 1656 to claim her freedom. But later in the 17th century, this freedom seems to have been public knowledge. As in the 1680s, Abraham Idana wrote in his description of the city of Amsterdam, "Slavery is not allowed here. Incoming slaves are free immediately. The many blacks from Brazil and other areas all work here for a salary." And it seems like that after the 1650s, this was really the case. So most of them were declared free. Because of these two developments, so to say, the increase of Africans that moved to Amsterdam in the 17th century, around the 1630s onwards, there's a small African community living within the Jewish area of Vlooienburg and surroundings, of dozens of men and women born in Africa, Brazil, or the Caribbean. In this period, most Black migrants married other people from African descent, and even if witnesses were needed at baptism, marriage, or at a notary, they sought them within their own little circle. On the basis of this type of documents, I have mapped a whole network of Black people in Amsterdam who knew each other very well. And between 1630 and 1670, most African men who married in Amsterdam were sailors or soldiers in the service of the West Indian Company. They married Black women that arrived as enslaved servants, or some were even born here in Amsterdam. Sometimes, in 1649, the now 44-year-old Peter Klaas married in Amsterdam with Lisbeth Jans from Angola. Others married before they left for the sea again, like Anthony Manuel of Santiago, who lived in the Turfstraat. As I've said before, most of these Black inhabitants of Amsterdam lived in what is now called the Old Jewish neighborhood. The area around the Jodebreestraat, the island of Vlooienburg, the former St. Anthony's Port, the Lepers House. Like other poor immigrants, they often lived with several families in small dwellings. But not all of them. Some lived at a more prominent place. Sometimes we come across the name of the family in whose house the marrying servant served. On September the 3rd, 1652, Marietje Kos of Angola, living with Moses Navarro in the Houttuinen, entered into a marriage with the Congolese sailor John Nunes. The Navarros, of course, were imported sugar traders in Dutch Brazil before. And in December 1661, 25-year-old sailor Francisco Cordero married Laurencia Bermont, perhaps a corruption of Belmonte. A suspicion reinforced by the fact that Daniel Belmonte was a witness to the marriage. Daniel Belmonte was an Afro-European Jew. We meet him at the Purim benefits of the year earlier, and he might have been the mulatto Daniel who was buried on Bethlehem in April 1673. His burial was paid for by the Portuguese community, as recently posted by Tom on the Sephardic Diaspora Facebook page. But there were also sometimes tensions between Black and Jewish migrants in Amsterdam. In 1620, a Black man, Abraham, was said to have attacked the Portuguese Isaac Spinoza, probably the grandfather of the philosopher, on the Leprosegracht. In 1632, there was a great violence and uproar by a group of Black men and women in front of the door of sugar trader Manuel de Campos, alias Capitão de Campos. And in 1654, the Afro-Brazilian sailor Peter Bruin was arrested for wielding a knife in the Portuguese Synagogue on the Houtgracht. He stated that he was there to ask, quote, some Jews about the whereabouts of his wife. Anyway, in Amsterdam lived a group of several dozen Black people who knew each other very well, and many of whose wives had previously or still were servants within the Portuguese Jewish community. Apart from this community, there was also a group of Black and mixed race people who stayed more or less within the Jewish community. And it's them I want to talk about the second part of this talk. What did their lives look like? How did they fit in the Sephardic society of Amsterdam and how many were there actually? How big the presence of Black servants, Jewish or otherwise, was in the vicinity of the Jodenbreestraat is of course difficult to estimate. The aforementioned remark by Ernst Brink seems to indicate that it was both significant and remarkable. The burial books of Bethlehem, as we have seen, preserved the burial of a few dozens Black Jews and mulattoes. And there were undoubtedly more, since a lot of information from the second half of the 17th century is missing. Moreover, this is based only on the entries that mention that someone is Black or mixed, or was buried at what was called O Lugar dos Negros, a separate place on the cemetery. This should be go back. In addition to the burials on Bethlehem, the Journal of the Imposta shows that several people of African descent and mixed descent received money. In the 1630s, Sara Mulata do Algarve, a black woman, Francisca, another one, Angelica, and a mulatto of the Spinozas all got some money. Examples are also known from the Amsterdam notarial archives, like the Black woman Sara Malaguesa, who came to Amsterdam with Duarte Rodriguez Mendes in 1617, and who subsequently lived and worked in the house of that family for another 40 years. Later this year, I will publish an article with stories of 10 Black servants working in Portuguese households, all in the 1650s and 60s. Taking all these sources into account, it seems likely that the first half of the 17th century, there were dozens, or by the middle of the 17th century, so to say, there were dozens of Portuguese families with one or more Black servants in their house. One example of a Portuguese Jewish family with several Black servants was that of David Vaz, alias Henrique Fernandes, a wealthy merchant with an account at the Amsterdam Exchange Bank and one of the 5 highest taxpayers to the Portuguese community. David Vaz and his wife had a close relationship with David Nassi and his wife Bripka. Their daughter Abigail Nassi received a bequest of 3,000 guilders from David Vaz. His wife Sarah was a sister of Manuel Diaz Henriquez, alias Matasia Aboab, whose son had this memento mori, that's now on screen, with a Black servant made by Benjamin Senor Godinez. Both Vaz and Aboab had a large network in Portugal, France, Madeira, and Brazil. Several Black people lived in the house of David Vaz, as evidenced by burial books of Bethlehem and by notarial deeds. In 1643, Catalina, alias Ruta, Swartine, so Black woman, living in the home of Henrique Fernandes, declared that she was expecting a child from none other than David Moreno, who had also served there. Whether Moreno, the name Moreno Brown here is an indication of David's color is not certain, but very possible. Ruta was not the only Black woman in the house of David Vaz. Of course, this statement was made because otherwise people would start talking about who was the father of the enslaved woman in his house. And it might have been David Vaz himself. So, but now this statement was made by Ruta that it wasn't him. So Ruta was not the only Swartin in the house of Vaz. On 10th of April 1647, several men make a statement at a notary about a jewelry theft committed by Abraham Drago in the house of Henrique Fernandes. Drago is said to have been assisted by Antonia, one of the Recuans Swartinnen, so one of Henrique Fernandes' Black women. 3 weeks later, on the 4th of May 1647, the child Sarah was buried at Bethlehem, daughter of the mulatta Cantamsa from the house of David Vaz. So this example of the house of David Vaz not only shows that some families had several Black servants in their homes, but also that some, if not all of these servants were Jewish. This is shown by the fact that they had Jewish aliases, like Ruta, Catalina, also known as Ruta, and Sarah, the child of servant Katamsa, was buried in the Jewish cemetery. It could well be that the others were also buried there, but I haven't been able to locate them. So what was the status of these Black people within the Jewish community? Was there a distinction between white and non-white Jews? In the first half of the 17th century, various rules regarding Black Jews and Jews of mixed descent were made by the Muhammad. This again shows that the phenomenon, of course, was not marginal. As mentioned, the first Sephardic Jews to settle in Amsterdam came from an environment where slavery was permitted, notably the Iberian Peninsula and Brazil. Therefore, it will not have been immediately clear to these migrants that slavery was not formally allowed in Amsterdam. When the first regulation of the cemetery in Ouderkerk aan de Amstel were recorded, the word escravos, slaves, was still used. In the second article, it was determined that there was a separate place, lugar separado, in the cemetery for escravos, criados, and moças, who were Jewish, but not of our nation. The word slave would soon no longer be used in the sources of the community, but the article shows again that from the very beginning of the community, Black servants with a background of slavery lived within the community and that they were often Jewish. As it was said, the people that were buried there were escravos, criados, and moças, who were Jewish, but not of our nation, but they were Jewish. Over time, new rules regarding Black Jews and Jews of mixed descent were issued with some regularity. In 1627, they had to be buried outside the enclosure, except for those who had a Jewish mother. Moreover, the conversion of Black and mulatto people was also drastically curtailed. In 1641, Ashkenazi and Black maids were no longer allowed to go to the synagogue early to occupy a spot in the women's gallery for their employers. And Black girls were also no longer allowed to sit in the front rows. In 1644, it was decided that Black Jews could no longer be called to any ceremony in the synagogue. It may not be a coincidence that precisely in 1644, more and more Jews from Brazil settled in Amsterdam. No doubt some of them had children of mixed descent in the family. In 1647, it was decided that there should be a separate place for Black and mulatto Jews, this time within the fence, except for those who had married to brancos, so whites, according to the law. They came to lie in a regular row. What all these entries show is that during the 17th century, there were Black Jews and Jews of mixed descent living in Amsterdam, who were part of the Portuguese Jewish community, but also that there was racial discrimination. Black Jews were increasingly not seen as full. But of course, this did not mean that they were suddenly no longer there. How this worked out in practice can be studied by means of concrete examples, microhistories. This gives us an insight in how individual families and the community as a whole dealt with this issue. I found documents about many families, including the Nassis and the Serranos, Naar and the Farrars, but I think the most striking example is that of the family Moreno Monsanto. In 1640, somewhere in the early 1640s, the Jesuit of mixed European and native Brazilian descent, Padre Manuel de Moraes, was arrested by the Inquisition on the suspicion of Calvinism. In the years before, he had lived in the Dutch Republic and had indeed switched to Protestantism there. In the then university town of Harderwijk, he had been in contact with, among others, the aforementioned Ernst Brink about Brazil. Ernst Brink was the one who taught that in the Breestraat a lot of slaves and Moors were living. In Amsterdam, he also had been in touch with several Portuguese Jews. Probably to save his own skin, he made several statements to the Inquisition about Brazilians and Portuguese living in Amsterdam as Jews. Among them was Manuel Rodrigues de Monsanto, alias Moses Moreno Monsanto. According to the Moraes, Monsanto had been a citizen of Pernambuco who had been circumcised in Amsterdam and had declared that he and his home had always been Jewish. Among them, his wife, Beatrix, escrava de Guinea, so slave from Guinea, Rachel Mulatta, his daughter, another daughter who had married a mulatto son of the Jew Solis. So now, what do we know about this multi-ethnic family who settled in Amsterdam? Are there other sources that can corroborate the Moraes story? And how did this family fit within the Dutch and Portuguese Jewish society? Manuel Rodrigues Monsanto was born in the 16th century in the Portuguese town of Fundão, a town with an important Sephardic history. In this small city, he married Beatrix Rodrigues. The couple had a daughter together, Raquel. The Monsantos, like many conversos, settled in Amsterdam in the late 16th century. Around 1602, Beatrix had become seriously ill. So it appears from several wills that Moses Moreno Monsanto drew up in Amsterdam later. As a result of this illness, Sarah became seriously handicapped. She needed permanent care. In Brazil, daughter Raquel married Gabriel Castanho. During the period of Dutch rule, Manuel and his family formally reverted to Judaism. From then on, they bore the names Moses and Sarah Moreno Monsanto. In or before 1636, just a few years after the Dutch occupation of Pernambuco, Manuel Rodrigues Monsanto, alias Moses Moreno Monsanto, and his crippled wife settled in Amsterdam. There are notarial deeds from that year onwards mentioning him as a resident in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, Moreno Monsanto engaged in the trade in Brazil wood, sugar, among other things. He also bought several properties on Vlooienburg and on the Houtgracht next to the synagogue. A statement by a Dutch maid from 1639 gives us an interesting glimpse into the family life of the Moreno Monsantos. On December the 10th, 1639, Annetje Jan stated on the request of Beatrix Rodrigues, the crippled wife, that in 1638 she worked as a servant in the home of the daughter of Beatrix Rodrigues and Manuel Rodrigues Monsanto, where she saw that Rodrigues was lame and crippled, as she said, and was treated very badly by Monsanto. She said that Monsanto had a relationship with a black woman whom he did treat very well, unlike his legal wife, and from whom he had a child. According to the maid, he even attempted to formally divorce through a rabbi, but was not granted it. He did, however, allegedly evict Beatrix from his home and did not allow her to return. Since the testifying Annetje was a servant in the house of daughter Rachel Castagna, I assume that Sarah lived in Rachel's house after her expulsion. This detailed statement by an Amsterdam maid is largely consistent with the statement made by Manuel de Moraes at the Inquisition court. True, the black woman's name was not Beatrix. This was the name of his legal wife, but it is true that he had a daughter of mixed descent who, confusingly, was named Raquel, like his eldest daughter. The older daughter, who according to de Moraes married a mulatto from the Solis, the other daughter, who according to de Moraes married a mulatto from the Solis family, remains a mystery. She must have been born in Brazil then, years earlier. But it's interesting to know that in the second half of the 17th century, a man called David de Solis from Recife lived in Amsterdam, who was indeed of mixed descent. 4 years later, so 1643, Moses Moreno Monsanto made a will before an Amsterdam notary. He would have several made up over the years before different notaries. One of these wills is kept in the Etz Chaim library. The others can be found among the protocols of various Amsterdam notaries. On the 22nd of October 1643, he had a will drawn up by notary Venturin, in which for the first time the name of the black woman in his house is also mentioned. Although he doesn't mention that she's black, this we only know from the statement by the Murrays and the maidservant. In his will, he bequeathed to his 3 children, Rachel, Jacob, and Judith Moreno Monsanto, whom he had procreated with Anna Vaas, and all the children they might have, his house and yard standing near the Jewish church in the city, which used to be the Jewish church. In fact, he had owned the old prayer house of Neuf Shalom, next to the now synagogue. A later deed shows that it concerned a house and yard with a total of 3 dwellings, and you can see it with the red arrow here. 6 months earlier, he received an important position within the Portuguese Jewish community. He was elected as administrator of Bet Haim in Oudekerk, a position he held at least for 2 years. His legal wife, Sarah Monsanto, died in 1645, after which Moses Moreno Monsanto and Anna Vaas lived together openly as husband and wife. In 1648, they also officially entered into matrimony. This did not happen by choice. In a will later, in 1654, he declared that he, in accordance with Jewish law, which was tolerated here, during the life of Sarah Monsanto, his first wife, who was very lame and miserable for 43 years, he had married Anna Monsanto, his present wife. For the Amsterdam authorities, this legalized adultery was apparently not acceptable. In his will, Monsanto additionally stated that he had married Anna in 1648 on the order of the chief officer Hasselaar. Now, what do we know of the 6 children that were born of this mixed race marriage? Moses and Anna had at least 6 children: Rachel, Jacob, Judith, Michael, Abigail, and Sarah. And these children were not the only children of mixed descent in the house. The last will of Moses' first wife Sarah shows that she had a black servant named Luna. And Luna also had a child, Esther, who was a mulatta. It is not unlikely that Moses was also the father of Esther, but I haven't found any evidence of this. In 1653, Luna Peregrina, so the servant of Sarah, signed the receipt for 200 guilders she inherited from the estate of Sarah Moreno Monsanto. When Moses Moreno Monsanto died in 1655, the household of the black woman Anna Vaas from Bahia possibly consisted of Anna herself, her 6 children aged 5 to 18 years old, the black woman Luna, and her daughter Esther. Over 40 years later, in 1699, Esther, Mulatta dos Monsanto, was buried at Bet Haim. It can hardly be otherwise that this was the same Esther. She was buried at the Lugar Separado, the separate place on the cemetery for black and mulatto Jews. Using various sources, we can follow the lives of these Jews of mixed descent in Amsterdam. Except for Jacob, all the children of Anna Vaas and Moses Moreno Monsanto married within the Jewish community. Rachel married the Moroccan Jew Joseph Calaco from Salé. Judith married Johan Luria. Michael married Hester Bueno de Mora of Frontera. This couple left for Suriname, where they had at least one son, who would later marry Judith's daughter. Michael Moreno Monsanto's presence in Suriname in the 1670s shows that there were people of mixed descent among the first Sephardic settlers over there. Abigail married Jacob Nunes of Lisbon. And Sarah married David Moreno, a tobacco spinner from Rotterdam. David wasn't not a good choice. He ran off with a Christian girl later and regularly ran afoul of the law. Sarah received regular support from the Portuguese poor institution. It would be going too far, given the time that I have to go into details of the lives of the Moreno Monsanto. But however, I would like to dwell on the end of their lives. How were they treated at Bet Haim? After all, there were important rules concerning the burial of blacks and mulattoes. When Moses Moreno died in 1655, he was laid next to his first crippled wife, Sarah. They had a reserved grave. When 8 years later, the black Anna Vaas died, in October 1663, she was buried on the other side of Moses Moreno Monsanto. According to the rules, after all, by her legal marriage to the Branco Moses Moreno Monsanto, she had become a fully accepted member, at least formally. While Esther, the daughter of Luna, was buried on the Lugar Separado, most children of Anna, even though they were born during the life of Moses' first wife, were treated as white members of the community, at least on Bet Haim, or so it appears. When Rachel Calaco died in 68, she was buried in a regular row with a stone. So was Judith 34 years later in 1702. Abigail, I haven't been able to find yet, but Michael probably was buried in the Jewish cemetery on Jode Savannah or Cassipora in Suriname. At least I haven't been able to locate him on Bet Haim in Amsterdam, in Oudekerk. With the legal marriage of Moses Moreno Monsanto, their children had also become full members of the community and even perhaps Brancos, whites. No documents seem to have mentioned their mixed ancestry. This, as I said before, we only know from the report of the Inquisition and the servant statement of 1639. Never again it's mentioned. Of the 6 children of Moses and Anna, only Sarah was buried at the Lugar Separado in 1702, next to a black woman. It is remarkable that Sarah came to lie in this spot. Maybe because of her ex-husband, David Moreno, who ran away with a Christian girl. And maybe here the Moreno also means that he was of mixed descent himself. Or the adultery or the criminal behavior radiate onto Sarah. It's difficult to ascertain. As the anecdote I told you today show that there was a significant number of Sephardic families in 17th century Amsterdam, with servants of color in their houses, mostly women who were converted to Judaism. Some of these servants lived for decades with this family, and some were family members. It is significant that many of these families were crossing the Atlantic several times. The case of Moses Moreno Monsanto, who married a black woman and had legally 6 children with her, is probably exceptional, but maybe not unique. In 1647, the option of marriage between white and black Jews was explicitly mentioned by the Muhammad. This is at least a hint that it was more common. The case also confirms that there was a difference in status between the legitimate mixed-race children and the illegitimate children within the same household, like Esther, the daughter of Luna. It is fascinating that the color of Anna Vaas, Moses Moreno's second wife, was, as far as I've seen, never mentioned by himself or in the community records, nor the color of their children. By means of the legal marriage, they had become fully accepted members of the community and maybe were seen as Brancos.
You mentioned that there were early burials in Bet Chaim and Ouderkerk and Amstel of enslaved people. The fact that they were buried in a Jewish cemetery, does this indicate that they themselves were Jewish, or were they buried there because they were property of Jews?
No, I think as the rules was also explicitly stated that it is for people who are Jewish, but not of the nation, so not Portuguese. So I think, but you never know if maybe the authorities said, well, you have to take care of your own servants. But indeed, I found also servants that were living within the Portuguese community, but were not Jewish, that were buried on Christian burial grounds. And even I know for sure that they came out of the house of some of the Sephardic merchants. So I would say that almost all of them that were buried on the Bet Haim were considered to be Jewish. Almost all of them that were buried on the Bet Haim were considered to be Jewish. Almost all of them that were buried on the Bet Haim were considered to be Jewish.
Listen, Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 explains the genealogy of Shem. Shem was a black man in Africa. If you repeat this back, Genesis 14 verse 13, Abraham steps on the scene. Being a descendant of Shem, which is a fact, means Abraham too was Abraham, born in the city of a black man called Nimrod, grandson of Ham. Ham had 4 sons. One was named Canaan. Here, let me do some explaining. Abraham, Isaac was Jacob had 12 sons, for real, and these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10.